Howdy there, folks. Welcome into this video here today. Very important video we're talking about. And I don't care how optimistic you are, how pessimistic you are, you have to absolutely consider what we're talking about in today's video. And I have some good frame of thought to share with you here today. I'm going to take you back in history, talk about these sorts of things. But if you are not caught up, now we're at the stage where people are talking about there's going to be a high probability that this is going to be a lost decade. Okay, essentially meaning 2020 through 2030 is going to be a lost decade. This will not be the first time this has happened if this does happen. Okay, and throughout today's video, I want to show you some very important things I've never shown in the history on my YouTube channel and give you some frames of thought how to think about this. I'm going to share with you the assets that massively outperform if this is going to be a lost decade, let's call it. And, you know, I'm going to also in this video share my perspective on the probability that I think this is going to be a lost decade, which my answer is probably going to shock a lot of people, to be quite honest. And but I think it's very important, and it's a subject we have to take serious. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed today's video. As always, I appreciate you joining me. Let's get straight into this, okay? So the first thing is 2000 through 2010. That was a lost decade. Okay, basically entering 2000 through the end of 09 and into the beginning of 2010, the S&P 500 lost money. Okay, it was down about 20% roughly, somewhere in there. So think about that for a moment. Like, you know, you buy into the S&P 500 at the start of the decade, and 10 years later, you lost money. Not only did you not gain money, but you literally lost money. Like, that's just hard for people to even fathom about, right? So that happened there, okay? And we'll talk about why that happened a little later on in this video that I think is very important, because you see something like that and it's like, how did that even happen? Like, that's crazy, right? 2010 through 2020, let's be quite honest, was a great decade, right? From basically the start of 2010 all the way through the end of 2019, it was a great decade for stocks. S&P 500 nearly went up 200%, which, think about it like this. Every 7-8 years, on average, roughly, maybe a little toward 8 years, you should expect the S&P to pretty much about double up, roughly. So the fact that we had well over that, it made it a tremendous decade. And there's certain reasons why that happened. We'll talk about that in this video as well, okay? And so right now, everybody's like, I don't know, what are we looking at here? Because basically, since the start of this decade, we're up 14%, right? But things just continue to get worse and worse and worse. I mean, heck, if the S&P 500 just continues to sell off over the next few months, next thing you know, we're going to be 3 years into this game, and we could be at a place where the S&P 500 is down after several years of this decade already happening, right? Now you begin to understand how we get to this place of, folks like Stanley Druckenmiller, who I have a tremendous amount of respect for, saying there's a high probability of this being a lost decade. Okay, now things are starting to add up a little bit here, right? Now, if we go a little deeper here, in the 70s, we pretty much had a lost decade. I mean, S&P 500 was up a little under 20%. But that's really bad performance for a decade. Okay, so I would almost call the 70s a lost decade, to be quite frank. Okay, now the 80s was a great decade for stocks, almost as good as the 2010 through 2020 wave. There, it was a great decade for stocks, tremendous. Okay, and that obviously followed up by the 90s being a great decade as well. And think about this for a moment, right? The 80s, there's a thought process that you can't have high Fed funds rate and have a situation where the stocks go up, right? And the stock market goes up. It's completely 100% false. The fact is, in the 80s, the Fed funds rate was insanely high. Anywhere between 6% at the lowest in the 80s, all the way up to 20%, okay? So the fact is, the 80s was a tremendous decade for stocks, despite interest rates being ridiculously high, okay? So, sometimes people try to think like stocks only go up with low interest rates or if you have high interest rates, they go down. And actually, if you just look at history, there's been time periods where, let's call it the Fed had interest rates pretty high and stocks did well. Other time periods when the stocks did poor and interest rates were high. Other time periods where rates were fairly low at that given moment and stocks did bad. The same exact thing, vice versa. So you can't just say low interest rates, we're going to the moon, high interest rates, we're done. It doesn't work like that, just based upon history. But the problem is a lot of investors only look at the market over the past, 10 years or so. They don't open up the books a little bit and they say, well, what happened in the 90s? What happened in the 80s? What happened in the 70s, 60s? And kind of go throughout time and kind of figure out, okay, there's different things that have happened in different time periods, okay? No, the 90s was tremendous for stocks. Arguably the best decade ever, okay? 1990 through, basically January 2000, unbelievable. I mean, we're talking about over 300% the S&P 500 went up. Yeah, I mean, we would all take that. We'd all gladly take that. Now, unfortunately, the stock market performed so unbelievably well that it stole some gains from that next decade, right? And I think that gets us into this next subject, which is why was 2000 through 2010 a lost decade, okay? Two main issues, and none of them had anything to do with the Fed or interest rates or anything like that, okay? First reason, we went into that decade in a horrible position in the stock market. We'd pulled way too many gains, basically forward in the late 90s, okay? It created valuations like we've never seen in the history of the stock market, other than maybe shortly before the Great Depression. But even in the latest cycle, which a lot of people felt like that was very bubblicious for stocks in late 2020 and into early 2021, we never reached the type of valuations we're talking about. We're going on in 1999. It was a whole different level. So basically, we had stolen a bunch of gains. We went into the new decade of 2000 into a overvalued stock market, and not just an overvalued stock market, but the most overvalued stock market in the history of modern times, essentially, okay? So that was bad. Then, toward the end of the decade, worst possible situation happens is the most massive recession we've seen since the Great Depression, which was a great financial crisis, right? So we went into the decade in a horrible position, and then we ended the decade in obviously a massive crash, right? And so if you're wondering, why was that a lost decade? Yeah, the recipe was there for why that was a lost decade, right? If it wasn't for that, that would have been a great, if we would have just went into this decade in a normal, if valuations were somewhat normal and not like insane, we would have been okay, right? And if we didn't have the great financial crisis, I'm sure we would have finished a decade somewhere up here, right? If we would have entered a normal environment and right here, it wouldn't have been a lost decade. It would have been a good decade. But it was not, because we went in super overvalued, and then we had a massive, epic, colossal crash that caused our company earnings to completely fall to pieces, and obviously nearly the entire financial system, right? Now, why was 2010 through 2020 such a good decade, okay? Nothing to do with, the Fed did this, Fed did that. No, okay? Two core reasons. First one is, we went into that decade with an extremely, in my opinion, undervalued stock market, where, stocks had been priced because of the great financial crisis in 08 and into early 09. They'd been priced like they were going to have no earnings forever and ever, right? So as earnings came back throughout that next decade, guess what else came back? Stocks came back, right? And they begin to become fairly valued over that decade, okay? So that's what helped the stock market through the first, let's call it 5 years of the decade. But what helped there at the end of the decade? Well, if you didn't know, corporate taxes got cut in a massive way. We went from 35% corporate tax rate to 21%. So we're talking about the government was like, we're going to take 14 percentage point less in taxes. So guess what? That's a whole lot more money is going to hit your bottom line. Every single company out there was immediately, because the government's going to take less money, much more profitable. And let's say tomorrow, the government's like, you know what? We're not going to take 21% anymore. We're not going to take any taxes. Well, guess what? Stock market's going to go on a boom like you haven't really seen ever. I mean, it's going to be ridiculous, right? And so when you have extremely undervalued stocks, earnings coming back, compound it with the lowering of obviously corporate taxes in a meaningful way, yeah, it's going to all add up to it being a great decade for stocks. And it was a great decade, okay? It was indeed. Now, who wins and loses in a lost decade? I think this is a really important subject, because if we're talking about this potentially being a lost decade, 2020 through 2030, who's going to win and who's going to lose in that whole situation, right? Well, if we look back at the last time we had a lost decade, which was 2000 through 2010, what you're going to find is companies that were able to grow revenue substantially year after year after year and continue to expand their businesses year after year after year, they actually saw their stock prices appreciate rather dramatically during that time period of a lost decade. of a decade where if you put money in an index fund, you lost money, right? And so Amazon's a perfect example of this, right? It entered the decade, by the way. Everybody would say it was extremely overvalued. It was a complete bubble stock, right? And the stock price fell like 90% from where it was at peak of 99 and into early 2000. And at one point on a split adjusted basis, you get the stock for less than 30 cents on a split adjusted basis, right? And by the time the decade finished, even though we were in the great financial crisis, it was like a $6, $7 stock, which was insane, right? But yeah, think about that throughout that time. And Amazon just continued to grow. Remember, Amazon back then was not this super respected, great almighty company like it is today that everybody like has this, unbelievable respect for Amazon. Amazon was just a company that continued to grow year after year after year. It wasn't rocket science what their business was doing. They just continued to grow. And this is, Amazon Web Services was non-existent during that decade. So it's not like you didn't see that coming. Amazon Web Services was really a 2010 through 2020 story. And obviously much nowadays around Amazon Web Services. Back then it was just an e-commerce company that continued to just grow their business year after year after year and would put up good numbers. And despite everything that was going on in that decade, you made tremendous amounts of money in Amazon, just a company that continued to grow year after year after year. And this website here, sometimes it's hard to find companies' historical revenues and things like that. This website here, marketplacepulse.com, you can go back and track their revenue over time, which I think is really, really cool because sometimes it's hard to do that unless you go back to like old, like investor presentations or annual reports and things like that. Okay. Monster Beverage, which used to be called Hansen's Natural Beverage, gave ridiculous returns during that time, okay? Simple business model. So when it entered the decade, it was a juice company. 2002, they launched a product called Monster. And, product starts to take off. And over that decade, they just continue to expand the product, get into more and more stores. The energy drinks in general just continue to grow, right? They came out with new flavors and things like that for Monster and continue to just grow their business year after year after year. And it ended up being a tremendous winner. I mean, 6,700% from where it entered the decade to by the end of it. That's just ridiculous, to be quite frank. But not rocket science. It's like they launched a good product. They continue to expand it over the decade. Companies that have their revenues continue to go up and up year after year after year, their stock prices do end up being rewarded. They do end up being rewarded. Apple did phenomenal. Apple was 2000 through 2010. Apple, especially 2000, back then, it was not super respected company. But what you saw in Apple was a company that continued to expand more and more stores, continued to expand products, come out with the iPod and iTunes and things like that, right? And continue to expand their business more and more and more. And then you saw them launch the iPad and the iPhone and everything that came along in that decade, right? And they performed amazing. And by the way, in this time period, Apple was never at jeopardy of going bankrupt. If anybody's not caught up on history here. Apple back in 97, 98, it was a real question on if Apple was going to be able to stay in business or not. But by the time you got to the next decade, which was 2000, there was no longer a question at that point. And now Apple just continued to grow and grow and grow their business. And so you could have looked at this one and been like, man, I like their products. They keep expanding. Their revenues are going up. They got this Steve Jobs guy who's doing a real good job turning the business around. And, they got something here, right? And yeah, the stock market went down, but Apple stock did tremendous during that time. Target just continued to expand stores, expand their business. And it wasn't, the biggest winner, but I mean, heck, down 20% versus up 46%. Oh man, that's rather attractive there, right? Look at a stock like Best Buy. I mean, shoot, I remember, this is like the time period I was in middle school and in high school, most of these years. And I remember I used to ride my bike down to Best Buy and either buy video games or CDs and stuff like that. I'm sure I spent a lot of money at Best Buy over the years, and I remember my dad did and stuff. And just a business that continued to expand, and it gave you a very nice gain over that decade, despite countless stocks being, not good, and the indexes in general being not good. Foot Locker, another one, 80% plus gainer over that decade, just continue to expand into malls. These aren't super, that's the thing. Every single one of these business models I'm showing you right now is not like some pie in the sky. No one saw that coming. I can't believe that company. All those companies just continue to grow their businesses, expand their footprint, and become better and better and better, and had management teams just running their businesses, right? And none of those are I never saw that coming. That's crazy, man. No one could understand that. This is simple stuff. And these stocks performed very, very well. Netflix, this is, by the way, most of my audience is 30s and 40s. So shout out to you guys, okay? But also shout out to the younger folks that sometimes watch my channel that you might be in your 20s, okay? Netflix from 2000 to 2010 was a very different business model from, the Netflix you guys see nowadays. It had nothing to do with streaming. This was back when, people used to actually send a DVD in the mail. Like Netflix would send it in the mail, then you'd send it back, okay? And this was a business model that just year after year after year continued to expand, continued to grow their business. Year after year after year, they did a tremendous job. And that stock did absolutely, it wasn't even a public company for the entire decade, but it did absolutely ridiculously well during that time, right? In a time period when you thought there couldn't have been money to be made in the stock market. Wow, there's a whole lot of money to be made there, right? So, what we can learn during that time is stock picking is absolutely 100% valuable, especially when you can't get gains in indexes, right? If every year the stock market just goes up and up and up, and every decade it just goes in doubles and triples or whatever, every single 10-year span, it's easy, right? We've been very spoiled, and we're being tricked into a philosophy now with index funds that everybody thinks, and it's a very false assumption, but because of what happened in this decade, that everybody thinks, oh, just throw money in an index fund, man, you make easy money, bro, you don't have to do anything. And it's like, listen, man, that worked for that decade, and that was easy. Throw money in an index fund, just make money, put in no work. But people haven't gone through a lost decade before, right? And that's not fun when you throw money in something and then you're down 20% by the end of it, right? And, in this sort of time period recently, right? And I'm talking about the past, let's call it 12 to 18 months, everybody's put down growth stocks, right? Like growth stocks are the devil because they performed so bad over the past 12 to 18 months, okay? I will 100% take anybody's bet that growth stocks will massively outperform the indexes over the next 5 to 10 years, and it won't even be close. Won't even be close. And everybody's got caught up into this hatred of growth stocks because they did so bad for the last 12 to 18 months, but people forget how these stocks perform over a decade. They go through some unbelievably violent times, and they can go through some drops where they drop 50, 70%, some crazy numbers. But the companies that keep growing year in and year out, their stock prices are always rewarded. I've never seen it where it's not rewarded, where a company grows revenues year after year after year, 10%, 20%, 30%, year after year after year, keep expanding their business, their footprint, where their stock price was not rewarded. Now, there's a lot of stocks in the stock market that won't have that sort of growth. So you've got to find the companies that actually do have that sort of growth, where they're going to keep growing 10, 20, 30% a year, year after year after year. And there's a certain sliver of those sort of stocks that are going to do that. And they will be rewarded handsomely. And the gains will be dramatic, regardless of what happens in the stock market. But, to just assume that the stock market is just going to go up almost every year, so just throw money in an index fund, I'm telling you, everybody's on that bandwagon. Everybody's on that bandwagon of don't buy growth stocks and buy index funds. What happens every single time the human population starts thinking everything's easy? Oh, it flips. Remember when everybody thought, oh, real estate only goes up, right? Why not just buy another house and another house and another house and another house? Oh, and then what happened? Real estate went down for 4 years. And some markets went down over 50%. Every single time, everybody starts thinking, it's so easy. Just put money over here. And the masses, that's what the masses all think right now. Index funds, everything else, what do you think's going to happen? The same thing that happens every single time, man. Every single time. It never fails, okay? Now, if I had to look at my crystal ball, and I had to put odds on the possibility of this being a lost decade for the indexes, okay? Which, by the way, I hope it's not a lost decade, because if it is a lost decade, one, it's going to mean a ton of people don't make money because most people don't either have the guts or they don't want to put in the work it takes to actually pick stocks, right? And actually find companies that are going to grow year after year after year. So from my standpoint, I hope it's not a lost decade, 2020 through 2030. I really do. With that being said, though, I would put odds. I think it's probably, I would say is about a 25% chance we're going to have a lost decade, which is actually pretty high, especially for somebody like myself that's an optimistic person. For me to feel like there's about a 25% probability we'll be in a lost decade is pretty decent, right? If I just look at it, I'm like, we might have pulled some gains forward in the whole situation. Obviously there's, there's going to be some dramatic times. Whether we escape a big recession right now, let's call it over the next year or not, remains to be seen. Let's say we do, right? It's definitely very much a possibility that we could get another major recession toward the later stages of this, and maybe we have a similar situation to like we had in 2000 through 2010, where we went into that decade kind of, not richly, we went in there super overvalued, and then we had a massive financial crisis, right? Maybe something somewhat similar where we didn't go into this one as overvalued, we went in richly valued, let's call it that, and then at some point we get a more major recession when no one's expecting it. Because the thing that is a little confusing about this whole thought process on a major recession in 2023, everybody's talking about it, everybody's expecting it. You can't go anywhere where it's not talked about. And as they say, a lot of times you never get a recession when everybody's expecting it. It's usually when everybody's like not expecting it and like, not really fearful of it or things like that. So, it wasn't like everybody in 2007 and 2006 was all walking around and talking about, we're about to have this massive recession, get ready. No, it didn't work like that. Caught almost everybody by complete surprise. And then all of a sudden it was there, and all of a sudden housing prices were crashing, and then all of a sudden, everybody's looking at Wall Street like, what's going on here? And the stock market's crashing, and people are losing jobs en masse, and people are like completely caught off guard in that situation, right? It wasn't like that was like everybody had that figured out and like it was going to come. So, maybe this is a first time in history that everybody knew it was coming and it actually came, or maybe it's just going to be another false alarm and then nothing's going to happen. And then something comes a little down the road, maybe in a few years where people aren't expecting it, right? Things can come out of nowhere. Look what happened in 2020. It looked like 2020 was going to be a good year overall. And the next thing you know, all of a sudden the economy was closed down overnight. Like what? Like surprising things can happen that people never saw coming. But if I had to put odds on it, I'd say about 25% probability, which, like I said, as being an optimistic person, for my odds to be that high, it's, it's a pretty decent probability. So, the main thing is you've got to focus on looking into companies and figuring out which companies are going to grow quite a bit in the future, and year after year after year, and put up growth year after year after year for the next, let's say, 7 or 8 years. If you do that, you're going to likely do extremely well. If you are buying in the stocks this year, next year, the year after, that are just companies that continue to post growth numbers year after year after year, I haven't seen it where it hasn't worked out, ever. That's not something that happens. Companies that shrink, have their revenues go down, things like that, it's a whole different situation. But for companies that grow year after year after year, their stock price end up being rewarded. Sometimes in the short term, it can look ugly for a 12, 24-month span. But over time, they outperform the stock market in good times and bad times. And it's not even close. It's a massive difference. It's between like life-changing amounts of money, like you can buy any home and any car and live anywhere and live life in your own terms type money, or it's like you're doing okay for yourself type money. So that's about what I have to say about that. Hope you guys enjoyed today's video. As always, much love. I think it's an important subject, and it's absolutely one that deserves attention. If you enjoy the videos and you ever want to say hi to me, send me a DM on IG. I appreciate all you guys for joining me as always, being subscribed to the channel. Much love, and have a great day.